to the amendment. The honourable member for Fish Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's a bit disconcerting, and I have to say to you that we actually, as a caucus, joked about maybe we should do our own referral to committee on this, because it's been the ping-pong ball back and forth between this committee and the Ministry of Justice and various other organizations. Mr. Speaker, this legislation has been addressed since 2003 by the ALRI. It was addressed in a unanimously passed at second reading bill in 2012, brought forward by Ken Allred. It was discussed and supported, the adverse possession component of it supported in many ways by members of this opposition, or sorry, by this government when Bill 204 came up most recently. But I wanted to look through some a little bit of chronology on this, Mr. Speaker, and refer to the body of recommendations, most specifically from the Alberta Property Rights Advocate and the Standing Committee on Resource Stewardship, which is, of course, dominated by members of the government side in support of abolition of adverse possession. That started in 2014, the Alberta Property Rights Advocate Annual Report, Recommendation 2014-03, submitted on June 22, 2015, that the law of adverse possession be abolished in Alberta, Mr. Speaker. So in March of 2016, when that report was addressed by the Committee on Resource Stewardship, it was determined that this recommendation should be reviewed and addressed by the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General based on these considerations. The committee recommends that the legislature not act on recommendations 2014-03 at this time, but instead refer to the recommendations to the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General for review. Mr. Speaker, a minority report at that time expressed from that committee, despite it being clearly within the committee's mandate to recommend that the legislature act to reassure Alberta landowners they are not vulnerable to this archaic law, the majority chose to abdicate its deliberate function and pass the matter on to the Minister of Justice to review at her leisure with no expression of support for the change. Mr. Speaker, at a subsequent meeting of the committee, it was noted that Standing Order 52.09, subsection 1, requires the government to respond to a report of a legislative policy committee with certain exceptions within 150 days from the date on which the committee reports to the Assembly. It is unclear whether the standing order was met at the appropriate time by the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General, but from what I've been able to determine from the committee reports, that was not met. Mr. Speaker, fast forward to July of 2016 to the 2015 Property Rights Advocate Annual Report, Recommendation 2015-02. It is recommended that Alberta Justice and Solicitor General be asked, and this is because of inaction, as the Ministry administering the Property Rights Advocate, to develop a process to ensure recommendations made by the Property Rights Advocate Office are followed up on or after they are endorsed by a standing committee of the legislature, or where the committee requests additional action, which they did. When the committee endorses or rejects a recommendation, it may be desirable to have a mechanism that demonstrates what follow-up was taken. Without a clearly defined process, as this is from the Property Rights Advocate, without a clearly defined process for follow-up, the work on the Property Rights Advocate Office, the committee and others who work on that may not bear fruit. I don't think there's any fruit coming from this committee and from the Ministry of Justice this time, and now we are trying to grow a new tree to try and bear the same fruit. Further, in the 2016 Property Rights Advocate Office Annual Report, and I quote, "In addition, both recommendations contained in the 2015 Property Rights Advocate Annual Report were unanimously endorsed by the Standing Committee on Resource Stewardship. Once these recommendations are fully implemented, the likelihood for government to identify and act upon ways to improve fairness and equity among property rights should be enhanced. In addition, implementation should increase transparency and accountability to Albertans by their governments regarding property rights." Property rights, that's what we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker. During its meeting on February 21, 2017, the committee made a further recommendation with respect to the common law doctrine of adverse possession in Alberta. While considering the issue, the committee acknowledged, and I quote, that the law of adverse possession is archaic and has been abolished in other provincial jurisdictions except Nova Scotia, which is currently in the process of abolishing this doctrine. The committee therefore determined that adverse possession should be abolished in Alberta. And we want to bounce it back to that same committee, Mr. Speaker? Based on these considerations, the committee, and I quote again, recommends that the government introduce legislation abolishing the common law doctrine of adverse possession in Alberta and all statutory references supporting adverse possession in Alberta. That sounds pretty clear to me, Mr. Speaker. July 21, 2017 would have marked 150 days from the date of that motion and that recommendation from the committee. And to date, we do not see evidence of response to the committee nor any action to abolish adverse possession, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, subsequently I had the chance to meet with the ALRI, and they told me that they have not gotten to this yet, that it has been pushed to them by the ministry and that it is in the queue, which means that they may or may not be able to get to it. And once they do get to it, it will take between 12 and 18 months. So we don't have a timeline of when they're going to address it, and we're told that it's going to take 12 to 18 months. Mr. Speaker, I have a constituent recently here who was in this House just last week who lost 1,000 square feet of his property, almost 1,000 square feet of his property, valued in the tens of thousands of dollars because of a misplaced fence for just over the 10-year limit. 11 years, I think, 11 and a half years. And when he decided and went to his neighbor and said, neighbor, why don't we put in a new fence? It's time. The fence is getting a bit run down. It's time to put in a new fence, and then we can kind of get this thing settled once and for all. Well, guess what, Madam Speaker? The next thing he got was papers served to him for adverse possession because that land was going to be seized by his neighbor at no compensation. And this is within today's law, Madam Speaker. So there's a time to get rid of bad laws. We have Section 69 of the Law of Property Rights Act, which will protect people where something has been done inadvertently, where a house or something or a garage is in the wrong place. And there are settlements and there are ways for that to be done with compensation, Madam Speaker, not a legal seizure of land. Legal seizure of land. Can you believe it? When I talk to my constituents about it, they go, no, you can't. You have to be kidding. Squatters' rights, I thought that was some sort of thing of the past that we talk about in sort of archaic terms, outdated and archaic terms, to use some of the terminology of the very committee that we're trying to send this back to. Madam Speaker, this is ridiculous for us to send this back to a committee that's treated this like a ping pong ball. We've had to force some decisions on that committee, and they finally passed it unanimously, Madam Speaker, unanimously, to recommend to this government that they abolish adverse possession. And now that ping pong ball came back into this legislature. We gave you the opportunity here today. We gave you the opportunity. We're giving you the opportunity to do what's right for your constituents. Your constituent that might lose their property with a legal, not an illegal, a legal seizure of land with no compensation because a fence was in the wrong place for 10 years and a day. Does that sound right to you? Now look me in the eye and tell me that, Madam Speaker. Have them look at me in the eye. Have them go to their constituents and tell them, oh, by the way, it's okay, I'm okay if we have this bad law in the books for another 18 to 24 months, or maybe never, it gets addressed by this government, that you can have your land seized. And they'll look at you and they'll laugh and you say, you're kidding me. That can't be a law today. This is a chance to get rid of a bad law, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. And you know what? There might be some other changes that we make to this law in the future as we see. But there is Section 69 to make sure that there is a way to adjust unintended buildings, unintended improvements, unintended location of buildings. There is a law in place to be able to adjust that. So this reasoned amendment, Madam Speaker, is not something that we should consider at this time. This reasoned amendment is a bit of a joke to me. In fact, we joked about it earlier today, is maybe we should do that just to sort of say that wouldn't this be crazy if this amendment were to pass, if this motion were to pass, this reasoned amendment. And we said, no, that's crazy. Why would we want to do that? Send it back to the very same committee? What for? Sorry, it's a reasoned amendment. It's being hoisted here. So the reasoned amendment, you know what? Bottom line is we've talked about this piece of legislation enough. We've promised Albertans. We've had the Property Rights Advocate tell us time after time after time. That's the Property Rights Advocate, a specialist in property rights, Madam Speaker. A specialist in property rights has told this legislature and that committee that they wanted to, and that committee agreed with that. And they said that they were going to do that, and they recommended it be done. So is this because the government is embarrassed in not meeting that 150-day rule once, that 150-day guideline twice, and now we're going into triple jeopardy on this, and we're going to push it down the road at least another 12 to 18 months? And the LRI, I'd love to hear if the LRI has actually given us a date they're going to start this. They only have 5 people there. 5 people, and they have other legislation they're dealing with. So you, by doing this reasoned amendment, are saying to Albertans that the seizure, the legal seizure of their land, the absolute disregard for their property rights, the disregard for our torrent system, which, by the way, Madam Speaker, the torrent system actually, we guarantee, and I'll use the terms here, we guarantee. So this reasoned amendment does not deserve to be.
Thank you.